Autumn, those lovely late summer days, perfect for taking the dog for a walk. And those cooler evenings when we're all tucked up indoors with the central heating on. Ideal for ticks and fleas. Hello, I'm Jane Constantinis. Half of dog owners worry that their pet is going to get ticks or fleas, and yet only 35% actively seek medical advice. So as owners, we know we should be checking and treating our pets. And yet, in a survey carried out recently by MSD Animal Health, it was revealed that very few of us are regularly or properly checking and treating our pets. And of course, many of us don't know what we're looking for in the first place. So, over the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to show you how to check for ticks, and you'll be pleased to hear that there are 900 species of them, and also how to check for fleas. And the good news there is there are 2,500 species which live on animals. We're also going to give you some useful advice on treatment options and, of course, how to avoid your pet catching them in the first place. And I'm joined by Derbyshire vet Paul Sands and zoologist, TV presenter and dog owner Chris Packham. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello, Jan.
Chris, have you always been a dog lover and owner?
No, not all of my life. As a kid, I was fascinated from animals from a very early age, but I used to capture things in jam jars and bags and smuggle them into my bedroom, and they were grass snakes and lizards and that sort of thing. And then I had an exotic collection of reptiles, and I moved on to animals that were rescued. The RSPCA used to bring them round, foxes and badgers and birds. It wasn't until 1980 that my mother brought the first dog into the house. It was a small black miniature poodle, and it completely transformed the lives of the entire family. And ever since then, I've had black miniature poodles. I've got two at the moment, Itchy and Scratchy, and they are the epicentre of my universe.
We can see that from the pictures that we're looking at.
I love them very much. They've got very strong characters, poodles. They've got boundless energy. They're a bit anarchic, and they do make themselves the centre of your life, you know. And Itchy is the dominant dog. He's the boss, or at least he likes to think he is, and they've all got their specific toys. Scratchy's often not allowed a toy. On special occasions, Itchy lets him have a little play for 5 minutes. So it's a very dynamic relationship, and from a zoological point of view, it's a fascinating one. Watching how they behave. We live pretty much as a pack, the three of us, I have to say. We don't go out hunting elk like their wolf progenitors would have done, but we share our lives together, and it's tremendously rewarding. I call them my joy grenades, because every time they go off, there's a great explosion of joy. I would never be without them.
And do they share also their fleas with you? Do they get fleas and ticks?
They have. It's very difficult to stop a dog getting fleas because they socialise. They're a pack animal, so they like to meet other dogs, and as a consequence, they hop from one to another. So yes, they've had fleas. I've never had an infestation of fleas, but typically when they jump up on the bed, I'll get that feeling of the animal, that insect moving across the body, and I know. And if I've forgotten their treatment, I'll immediately get onto the case. Ticks are different, and once they're onto the animal, they will stay on that animal. And to my shame, on a couple of occasions, it's got to the stage that the tick has fed, engorged with the blood that they require to produce their eggs, and only then have I found them. Now, I say to my shame, because by that stage, of course, I've exposed Mr. Itchy and Scratchy to the potential of disease and discomfort. So I try to be as diligent as I possibly can when it comes to looking for these parasites.
Paul, in layman's terms, we're coming to you for the science fix now, what are ticks and fleas?
Ticks and fleas, Jane, are very well adapted parasites that have been around for millennia. They've fed on pets for millennia. They've lived with people for all that time as well. They've adapted to living in our homes, particularly fleas, over the winter months. What with the wall-to-wall carpeting, central heating, soft furnishings, fleas are brilliantly adapted, particularly to living in our homes. They don't worry about their social status, wealth, how clean your home is. Having fleas on your pet does not mean you have a dirty home or you're unhygienic in any way. As for ticks, they are also amazingly adapted. They also, like fleas, feed on blood. They will suck blood from our pets and from ourselves and can spread some really horrific diseases. So they are really worth looking out for, and particularly for avoiding.
Yeah. And of course, the first time that many of us even know that our dog has an infestation is when we go to the veterinary surgery. So how do the experts check for them? Well, Paul, very helpfully for us, went along to a Bristol veterinary surgery to find out more.
I'm at the Highcroft Veterinary Surgery in Bristol. So let's meet Polly Cornwell, one of the senior vets here at Highcroft Veterinary Centre. So Polly, what is it that you find here at Highcroft in relation to flea and tick infestation?
Well, we always see a lot of fleas all year round, but considering we've had a little bit of warm weather recently, we've definitely seen increased numbers. I think it's the warm and dry that they like, isn't it? So warm, dry weather outside, they absolutely love and they breed outside, but of course with the central heating in the winter,
yes,
it's lovely and warm and dry inside houses nowadays with your wall-to-wall carpets and your central heating.
Polly, you must examine a lot of dogs and cats here at Highcroft. What sort of signs do you look for? How do you carry out such an examination? Well,
we've actually got somebody just waiting to come in for an examination now, so if you'd like to join me, we can actually go through that together.
I would love to. So what I'd like to do is just give Rocco a little examination from head to toe, top to bottom, see if there's any signs of any skin issues or fleas or ticks. So, Rocco, let's give you a thorough check over. So far so good. Using your fingers just to stroke across the whole of the body. All right, we've got a flea comb, and we're going to actually just simply run the comb over Rocco's body. So we have this white paper with the debris from Rocco's coat, and we're getting some cotton wool soaked in water. And what we can do at this stage is we can simply place that on there, and if any of those are flea darts, these bits of debris will dissolve to form an orange-red stain. So far, I think Rocco seems free of fleas or ticks. Good boy, Rocco.
Good news there for Rocco and the owner, Jenna, no ticks or fleas. Chris, have you ever had that experience where you go to the vet with condition A and they discover that your dog has fleas?
Not in the case of fleas, no. Despite the fact that poodles have that thick woolly coat, I've always managed to spot the fleas because they spend time off the dog and on me. So I've not got to the vet and had had them discover that they've got fleas. They've picked up on other things occasionally, invariably their teeth, because they're prone to tartar. So whenever I get to the vets, for whatever reason it is, I'm being told off because they've got too much tartar on their
Tell
teeth.
us off for something, won't they, you lot?
Absolutely.
What percentage of the people you see, not the people obviously, the animals, do have an infestation when you get to examine them?
I would say at least 10% where I can see clear evidence of parasitism, some sort of parasite, particularly fleas. They're very, very common. Actually, ticks are remarkably difficult to find when they're in the juvenile stage. They're perhaps the size of a pinhead. And particularly if we imagine that our pets are covered with dark fur, a bit like Chris's dogs, they can be really difficult to find juvenile stages. The larger parasites, ticks, if they're fed, engorged, much easier to find, like a little wart or pimple.
And what is the reaction generally of the 10% where you have to say, actually, your dog's got fleas?
It's a mixed reaction, Jane. Frequently, people are thankful that they've been informed so they can take the corrective advice. But most of the time, they're offended. Sometimes really offended, as if you've accused them of something horrendous. I sometimes see the arms folding, and they're looking at me going, are you implying I have a dirty household?
Yeah.
And it's not that. It's just that their pets are outside, walking around in parks and gardens and mixing with other dogs and sometimes wild animals, and they're picking up these parasites. And these parasites are brilliantly adapted to living on our pets and disappearing through the fur.
Yeah.
So, shock and horror.
Or maybe they're concerned that you're passing judgment on their parenting skills, is what I'm going to say.
Perhaps, but we have to reassure them that these are really common problems. And many, many pets, no matter what type of social scale, they will pick up these parasites outside.
Yeah. So you started to talk about dark hair, long hair, short hair. How much more difficult is it to spot them on an animal that has, say, long dark hair?
I think very, very difficult. You've literally got to go through them with a fine-tooth comb, and even then you could miss. You've got to go through every inch of the pet's body. There are certain areas that you'll find more fleas and ticks, but you've got to check them all over. So a vigilant owner will check their pet with a fine-tooth comb regularly, several times weekly, I would recommend.
Or just get a pet that's got white fur.
Perhaps. Perhaps.
I bet you didn't know that the dictionary definition of a flea is a small, wingless, jumping insect which feeds on the blood of mammals and birds. Nice. And the dictionary definition of a tick is a parasite that feeds on the blood of animals, including humans. Very nice. Chris, even having heard that, I bet you still like them. For some reason.
I do. I'm one of those peculiar people that likes all life. And I greatly admire parasites because they're highly specialised organisms and they live in difficult environments. When you think about those that live inside other animals, inside us, it's a very hostile environment. And when you've got animals like ticks, you know, they're out there at low densities, they gravitate towards our dogs, so we see lots of them, but they've got to find mates. And very often these animals are species specific when it comes to their host. So a species of flea will only parasitise a particular species of bird, mammal or animal. So it's not just got to find a dog, it needs to find a particular type of animal. And to actually achieve that is remarkable. So yes, I have a great admiration for them, but I don't want my dogs itchy and scratchy, itching and scratching. Yeah. You know, I want to enjoy these animals and their life cycles and life histories at a distance.
Yeah, or crawling on you on a Sunday morning when you've got the pages
They can come on me as long as I spot them and get them off. That's fine. Yeah.
But what impact do they have on the animals? Do they cause suffering to dogs?
They certainly do, Jane. I see no end of dogs and indeed cats who get irritated skin. They lick and they scratch and they pull out their fur, they nibble at their own skin. They can cause skin infections. There's a condition called flea allergic dermatitis. I see that very, very commonly. And that can be due to just a small number of fleas in a very sensitized individual. So irritation and skin infections at the very least. At worst, fleas can transmit the flea tapeworm to pets as well as people. So it's a very clever life cycle whereby the flea will actually ingest the tapeworm egg, and then that develops inside the flea. The pet will then lick itself to rid itself of the flea because it's irritated, and it'll swallow the flea containing a tapeworm. So one pet can spread a tapeworm to another via a flea as a vector. Again, brilliantly adapted, as Chris has alluded to.
And earlier on, you alluded to ticks, and when they're engorged, there's the danger that they're causing health risks, problems to the animal. What sort of health risks are we talking about?
Well, anything that's sucking blood and is relatively large is capable of transmitting disease, bacterial or viral diseases. And one disease that we have in ticks, which is becoming increasingly prevalent as their numbers increase, is Lyme's disease. Now, Lyme's disease can affect humans with disastrous results. I know a couple of people who've had it, and one of them, sort of 2 years taken out of their life. No work, neurological damage, and all sorts of incapacities as a result of that. One tick bite. So we've got to be increasingly vigilant when it comes to ourselves. But of course, Lyme's disease can also manifest itself in dogs too, with equally disastrous results. So managing populations of ticks when they're close to us and our pets is something that we have to do critically. And equally, fleas, a blood-feeding organism. In the past, you'll know that they spread the Great Plague, the Black Death. This was a different species of flea. We have nothing to fear from that at this point in time. But yes, they can be efficient vectors of that.
And why are they so difficult to get rid of? And are they particularly prevalent at certain times of year, for example?
Well, I would say fleas would be prevalent throughout the year. In fact, this time of year, September onwards, people will be turning on the central heating. A lot of flea life cycle, which is down in the carpets and bedding, these fleas will become active. And we will see an increase in flea-related issues through autumn and winter. People always thought it was just a summer problem. Not at all. These pets live in our houses. They're domesticated to live with us. Ticks, year-round, but mainly spring into summer. But ticks do overwinter in the United Kingdom as well.
So what you've highlighted there, of course, is the idea of environment, that they're not always living on the animal.
No, the vast majority of the life cycle in the flea case is off the animal in the environment. That's why you'll see a pet with no signs of fleas whatsoever, and yet they are in the environment.
Jane, you've got to admit they're good animals. They're good at what they do.
Amazing.
They're good at finding a host, and they're good at surviving. And that's what makes Paul's job so difficult when it comes to treating them, and our job so difficult when it comes to finding them in the first place. We're dealing with experts.
You really do admire them, don't you?
Well, I do, but equally I want us to get on top of the problem.
You may not admire them, but you may want even more information and advice, so why don't you go to mypetonline.co.uk. You'll find everything you need there. As you've just said, Paul, ticks love long grass, so do our dogs. They love to roll in it. And fleas love these warm, dry climates, otherwise known as our houses, in autumn and winter. Paul went off and did an experiment for us in Bristol a few months ago. So he went with Professor Richard Wall, who's from the Bristol University School of Biological Sciences. And they went in search of ticks in the long grass.
So, Richard, we've been talking about how deer can present certain dangers to dogs in parks such as this one in Bristol. What sort of dangers can they present?
Well, the main problem is that the adult ticks in particular feed on the deer, and then they drop off when they're fully engorged, and then they lay large numbers, 2,000 to 3,000 eggs on the ground. And those eggs hatch and turn into the next generation of ticks. So where we find deer, we find lots of ticks.
What's happening with tick numbers? Are they on the increase? Or?
Well, as far as we're aware, tick numbers do seem to be increasing. They seem to be increasing across the entire country, not just in this one park. And that might be associated with increases in deer numbers, but also with changes in the climate. We think that as it's getting milder, wetter, warmer springs, we're getting larger numbers of ticks questing and bigger problems with people and their animals being bitten.
How do dogs, for example, pick up these ticks?
The ticks are in the vegetation. They're simply questing at the tips of the vegetation, waving their legs around, waiting for the animals to pass. And as the dogs move through the vegetation, the ticks are extremely adept at grabbing hold very quickly of the dogs and then moving onto the skin of the animal and selecting a site to feed.
How long do you think these ticks would hang around for on the ends of the grass and other plants?
Well, it very much depends on the climate. They like warm, mild, wet conditions. So as it warms up into the summer, the ticks will disappear. They'll crawl back down into the wet vegetation and they'll hide there over summer. But if it stays wet all summer, then the ticks might be around all year.
But Richard, how have you been collecting data when you've been experimenting in the parks here?
Primary thing we do is a very simple blanket dragging technique.
Okay.
We take this 1 metre square of cloth on a stick and you simply drag that over the vegetation, and the ticks think it's a passing host and they grab hold, and you can then turn the blanket over and count the numbers of ticks on that blanket.
Wow. How do we then assess what are the ticks and what are other insects and bits of dirt and things like that?
Well, every single black speck on this blanket is a tick. So there must be 300 or 400 ticks that we've collected in that one sort of 2 or 3 metre swipe across the vegetation.
That is absolutely incredible. And even one of these landing on your pet dog could be enough to cause trouble.
Indeed, it could. Larvae are extremely small and extremely difficult to detect.
This is really quite large, this one, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's an adult waiting to engorge and waiting to pounce on a host as it walks past.
It surprises me how tiny these are, and it makes me think that anyone with a dog which is perhaps has dark fur, you just ain't going to see these, are you?
That's correct. I mean, certainly the nymphs get slightly larger when they feed, but a dog with dark skin, dark fur, or particularly long-haired breeds, it's very difficult to detect them, particularly at this life cycle stage. It's why it's so important for people to be aware of the risk of ticks and to make sure they do inspect carefully and that they use appropriate tick treatment if they live in an area where they know there's a high tick risk.
Sure. I'm genuinely astounded by this sheer number of ticks here. It's amazing.
Wow, how many ticks were there on that sheet? Don't worry, I'm going to introduce you to these lovely ladies and the lovely Robert in just a minute, but let's carry on with the tick theme. So deer carry ticks. Any other animals?
Yes, we certainly see sheep in the UK carrying large numbers of ticks, hedgehogs, foxes, lots and lots of wild mammals, badgers, you name it. Very widespread.
So that makes life very difficult for dog owners who take their dogs for walks in large parks, for example.
Absolutely it does. And these things are very, as you saw how small they were, the juvenile tick stages, Jane, they're extremely difficult to spot on haired animals.
I think one thing is people think they pick these things up just in the countryside, so if they go out on the weekend they might get them. But bearing in mind the number of mammals that we have living in our towns and cities these days, there's every reason to be fearful that your animal can pick up ticks in the city as well. We've got foxes, we've got badgers, and we've got large numbers of dogs there as well. All of these are hosts for these types of animals, so just because you're in the middle of a city doesn't mean that you're free from the risk.
So what can owners do as a sort of preventative measure?
Well, apart from checking their pet over regularly, it's probably more important to use a reliable product to prevent in the first place. Prevention, as we know, is better than cure. It's probably better to prevent your pet catching these parasites because of their welfare and also down to cost. I see how expensive it can be to treat severe infestations in people's households, or when their pet gets a severe, sometimes life-threatening infection. So use a reliable, safe product.
And if you want to get your pet checked out professionally, then you might want to take advantage of what's called the Big Flea Guarantee. So go on the mypetonline.co.uk website, find your nearest participating vet, and they will offer you a free check for ticks and fleas for your animal. But of course, we should be checking, as we hear time and time again, we should be checking our pets regularly ourselves. The question is, how do we do that effectively? And that's why we've invited Robert and Flora and Kin to help us. Robert, introduce us to your delightful girls here.
Well, the big dog at the front here is Flora, and she's a 2.5-year-old Akita. And the little one sleeping by her side here is a very similar breed. She's 18 weeks old, and she's a Japanese Akita Inu.
And are you very good, and come on, tell us the truth, at checking for infestations?
I am very diligent, yeah, because it is something that gives me great cause for concern. So, you know, I groom them regularly, and while I'm grooming them, I'll go over them and check for any infestation if there is anything there. Obviously, like you said before, darker coloured dogs are actually harder to detect anything in. So I'm probably a little bit more diligent with Flora, she's darker. Kin, obviously a nice red and white, and it's a lot easier to see if anything's amiss with a coat that's colour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you say regularly, how often are you checking?
Well, I groom them every day, so pretty regularly, yeah.
Okay, sounds like you've got it down to a fine art. But Paul, can we invite you to demonstrate for others who maybe are not so diligent how we might go about checking a dog like Flora?
Certainly. First of all, I would recommend buying one of these flea combs, very finely toothed flea comb. These really do help with picking up parasites on your pet, but really you've got to drag this through the fur of all of your pet, because they can pick up ticks anywhere in the body, not just around the face and the front limbs where they're passing through the undergrowth, but anywhere in the body. Fleas, again, anywhere, but principally around the armpits, the groin, the undercarriage, along the back and the thighs. We regularly see flea infestations, and all it takes is one flea just to cause an irritation and scratching and licking. So I would definitely recommend a flea comb for starters. And basically, and I'm sure Flora seems quite relaxed here at the moment.
Well, she's obviously used to it, isn't she?
I think she possibly is. You can actually just use your fingers initially to part the fur. Look at how dark the coat is as you go further into Flora's coat. The skin itself is quite pale, so you would potentially see fleas standing up against that. But you could spend half an hour easily, I'm sure you'd agree with that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Going through her fur. You could get ticks in and around this little area here, this little Henry's pouch it's called, anywhere in around the ear. I've seen ticks in many different species in the ears. They love this warm, humid environment.
And when you find a tick, how do you remove it?
That's a really important question. It's important not to try burning it off with a match or cigarette.
That's the old wives' tale, isn't it?
You'll probably cause damage to the tick, which will then express its contents into your pet, along with infectious disease. There is a very clever device called a tick hook, which is just used to slide under the mouth parts of the tick, and with a simple twist you can remove that. If in any doubt at all, take your pet along to the vet, where the vet or nurse will remove the tick very carefully. Don't use flat tweezers that you would perhaps remove eyelashes with, because that will crush the mouth parts and potentially again inject infection.
So actually better to leave it and go to the vet.
Probably, unless you're quite well versed in how to remove it with a correct device. So again, with Flora here, you really got to work through the whole coat, and again you can see right down to skin level. But
she's got a terrible root problem there. She needs to have those done.
Absolutely, she does. But you can use a flea comb, and basically you can brush through Flora's coat. And actually, this takes a long time. You know, you've got to be working through the whole of the fur, removing dead hair as well. It's quite important. And what we'll frequently do when you've picked up lots of dead fur and scale is you can clean this onto a piece of white paper and then dissolve it and see if there's any little bits of flea dirt, which will show up as a reddish brown stain, which is actually your pet's blood, because
Right.
the flea has been
Yeah.
feeding on your pet.
And of course, as you're going through, the fleas are jumping off.
They will run very
so you've got to
quickly.
be quick.
They will move very quickly.
Yeah.
Chris probably knows some statistics of flea athleticism. Chris, can you
Yes.
remember some?
They are great athletes.
Well, I
They
keep
can
checking.
jump 200 times their own height, 150 times their own distance. That's like you popping down the road and jumping over the Shard in a single bound.
Wow.
And landing 40 football pitches away. So we're looking at extreme athletes here. When they hatch from the egg, they can jump 40,000 times before they've had a meal. They've got the energy already there.
Wow.
Good animals, you see.
Yeah, good pets.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. So don't forget to check around the rear end. This is very important, around the hips and thighs and back of the thighs. But that's quite a job. You imagine doing this with a flea comb. I know Robert's obviously very astute and spends a lot of time doing this with flora and kin. Many of us don't either have the time or the knowledge to do this. And ultimately, we could miss. I am sure I have missed many parasites on dogs over the years, for sure. You're better to give something effective to prevent the pet picking up the fleas and ticks in the first place.
Yeah. Now, what about Kin? She's 19 weeks, did you say?
18 weeks.
18 weeks. So how soon should you start checking a puppy like this?
Straight away. I mean, if the adult dog has got parasites and they've given birth, you've got a little hot pile of puppies there in a litter. Paul was telling me earlier that their sensitivity in terms of the skin doesn't develop initially, so they won't perhaps be scratching. They can't feel the irritation, which actually arises from the flea or tick's saliva when they're in the process of biting. And unfortunately, I've seen video pictures and still photographs too of litters of puppies that are absolutely infested with fleas. And when the animals are that small, that means that there's a risk of anemia if they've got so many of them sucking their blood. So yes, if you are breeding dogs and you have kittens and puppies, you must check them as soon as they're born.
Is that all is that helpful, Robert? Have you learned anything, or were you doing it brilliantly in the first place?
I'd like to think I was doing it brilliantly in the first place. It's always really good to have it reinforce, you know, what I am doing, and you know, listen to the experts and hopefully continue doing it correctly.
Okay. And can we end with your two top tips then on preventing, because as you said, prevention is better than cure, preventing our dogs from getting these infestations?
Well, it's very difficult to stop fleas getting onto your dog, and as you've seen from that experiment with all of those hundreds of ticks on that one sheet, if you're walking your dog in that park, you know, you're not going to stop them. These are professional parasites. They're going to get onto your animal. So, you know, once they are on there, you've got to make sure that they get off as quickly as possible, and that's where prevention comes in. Yeah, you can't beat their behaviour. You've got to beat them once they're on the host.
Yeah, I would completely agree with Chris. Prevention definitely better than cure. Cheaper than cure as well. As for finding juvenile ticks on a pet, good luck. They're extremely small, extremely small. You could easily miss them. You have to be very, very diligent, or better still, use a preventative product that's safe and effective, but lethal to the fleas and ticks.
But if we can't achieve that, and we do have an infestation, what are the various types of treatment that are available, and which are the most effective?
Well, Jane, there's a wide range of treatments available to kill and repel fleas and ticks on our pets, from simple spot-ons, which can last typically about a month, through sprays and collars. There are also chewable tablets whose effect can last up to 3 months. That's an interesting development.
And is it best to seek professional help as to which treatment is appropriate for your particular pet?
Definitely. I would say the best advice is to log on to mypetonline.co.uk and ask about the Big Flea Guarantee.
And then in terms of choosing a treatment, is it best to actually go and see a vet?
Definitely. Your vet's in the best place and position to advise you on treatments that will be safe and effective. There are some treatments which are less effective out there. If you're going to put any effort in, use one that works.
Well, thank you very much indeed to all of you, Paul, Robert, Chris, and of course the stars of the show, as always, upstaged by the animals, Flora and Kin. And thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.